coming here today. I'm Henry Kelly. I'm the president of the Federation of American Scientists. And as you may know, the Federation was founded by the Manhattan Project scientists 60 years ago. And its founding mission was to encourage international transparency in the nuclear industry and to discourage the spread and proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now, these scientists understood from the beginning that in the wrong hands, nuclear weapons presented the gravest possible security threat to the United States and to the world. And even a crude bomb detonated in an American city could kill hundreds of thousands of people. But our founders would certainly not be pleased by the way international control of these weapons has evolved since 1945. Today, more than a decade after the Cold War ended, the likelihood that a nuclear weapon will be detonated in anger is probably as high as it ever has been. And the danger can only get worse as the world turns increasingly to nuclear power to provide a low-carbon source of electricity in the absence of any coherent international agreement on controlling the proliferation of weapons. And it's the absence of such a framework that brings us here today. Because during his visit to India last March, President Bush and Prime Minister Singh announced a deal allowing trade in nuclear technology between the two countries in exchange for bringing roughly half of India's nuclear reactors under international inspection. The Federation opposes this agreement, which remains in negotiation, because we feel it undermines the Nonproliferation Treaty. This is extremely painful to us because it's essential that the U.S. and India strengthen ties, particularly in fields that can provide inexpensive sources of energy without damaging the environment. And we recognize that the U.S. and Russia bear enormous burdens of responsibility for the sad state of affairs of nonproliferation. Both the U.S. and Russia have about 5,500 nuclear weapons in their operational arsenal and are continuing to invest in improvements to this arsenal and dignifying the use of these weapons. So it's because of these concerns that 37 Nobel Prize winners who are members of our FAS Board of Sponsors signed a letter to members of the Congress, which I will read to you. Nothing is more important to U.S. security than blocking further proliferation and possible use of nuclear weapons. The recent nuclear agreement with India weakens the existing non-proliferation regime without providing an acceptable substitute. It should not be approved in its current form. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, backbone of international efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapon technology, is crumbling and needs to be replaced with a new international framework, one that reflects the dramatic changes that have taken place, that have occurred during the 30 years since the treaty was written. New agreements must preserve the many strengths of the current treaty and increase interparticipation. Bilateral ad hoc agreements, such as the one just announced with India, undercut U.S. and world security. We strongly endorse actions that can stronger ties between India and the United States in trade and research, and we believe that worldwide expansion of civilian nuclear power has the potential to provide electricity without increasing carbon emissions to the atmosphere. Rapid growth of civilian nuclear power will, however, greatly increase both the amount of fissionable material transported and stored worldwide and the number of nuclear fuel production facilities that can also be used to build nuclear weapons. It is essential that the U.S. help lead an international effort to design nuclear proliferation controls that reflect these new dangers, a regime that India can fully support. Such an agreement must include willingness by the United States, Russia, and other nuclear powers to renounce the legitimacy of nuclear weapons and reduce their numbers to levels far below those called for in existing agreements. Now, we've brought together several distinguished speakers to address this issue in more detail, and they'll be introduced by Ivan Ulrich, who's our Vice President for Strategic Security.
Thanks, Henry. As Henry said, the Federation of American Scientists was founded by scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project 60 years ago and more, developing the first nuclear weapons. And one of the founding principles of the Federation was the civilian control of nuclear research and nuclear technology, and openness, and that means international openness in the nuclear industry that at the time didn't even exist, but that they foresaw. This nuclear deal with India is a perfect example of the kind of issue that the Federation was founded to deal with. I want to make clear that, as Henry said as well, We believe that this deal is flawed not only because it doesn't do enough to constrain India's nuclear program, but it's disappointing because it doesn't do enough to constrain the U.S. nuclear program and the Russian one and the rest of the world. We have to keep in mind that most of the nuclear weapons in the world belong to the United States and Russia. And the United States in particular is in a pretty weak position lecturing the Indians about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty or the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty or the Nonproliferation Treaty. And we recognize that this is not, we don't want to be casting India as the bad player here exclusively. There's a lot of work to be done on our side as well. Congress is now being forced to deal with this issue. We don't really have a status quo that we can go back to because doing nothing would be rejection of the deal. Action is required by Congress. So even failing to act would be interpreted as repudiation of the deal. We have no option of letting the status quo persist. So something has to be done, and to make a good decision about that, we need some context. And for that, we've brought two very distinguished speakers, and if I had thought about it, I would have grown a beard. Len Weiss and Michael Krepon. Len Weiss was originally a professor of engineering and mathematics, and he came for Washington for 1 year, and he just never left. He's worked for the United States Senate for over 2 decades, including as Senator Glenn's staff director on the Governmental Affairs Committee, and he was instrumental in implementing the Nuclear Nonproliferation Act of 1978. And Len will give us a background and a history, explain how we got to where we are today. Michael Krepon is the co-founder of the Stimson Center, and he's published very widely, a very prolific writer, and his current focus is on South Asia. Michael, I have to say, is one of the very few people who, he was one of the very first people to foresee that something big was on the horizon, something big was brewing with India, and he's done an enormous amount to get this nuclear cooperation deal on the political radar scope, and he was one of the first analysts to sound the alarm. I was going to ask Len to speak first, and then Michael, and I think it'd be more efficient if we just let both speakers talk, and then we'll take questions for both of them at the end, okay? And I'll just get out of the way now. You can sit here or there?
I'll do it up there.
Okay.
Thank you. Ivan said that I was going to say something about the history, but I actually hadn't planned to do that, but I can give you a very brief introduction as to why we're where we are. India signed two contracts in 1956, one with Canada and one with the United States. The Canadian agreement was an agreement to get a research reactor, which is called the Cirrus reactor. The contract said the reactor was to be used only for peaceful purposes. The United States contract with India provided for the sale of heavy water for that reactor, and the contract also specifically said for peaceful purposes. Nonetheless, the Indians took the reactor and started stockpiling the plutonium from it in a weapons program. And the United States found out about it and ultimately sent an aid memoir to the Indian Atomic Energy Commission saying that if the Indians were to use the plutonium from the reactor, which had heavy water in it, for nuclear weapons purposes, it would be a violation of the terms of the contract. Nonetheless, that was 4 years before India exploded its device in 1974. So, when India exploded its device in 1974, there was considerable outrage on the part of a lot of people in the United States, including people in the Congress. And over a period of a few years, legislation was introduced for the purpose of trying to ensure that something like that would not happen again. And I had a major hand in that legislation, which is called the Nuclear Nonproliferation Act of 1978, which provided for specific items that had to be satisfied by a non-weapon state in order to receive nuclear trade from the United States. One of the items is a requirement of full-scope safeguards, meaning safeguards on all nuclear facilities in the non-weapon state. And as a result of that, India was, because India would not accept full-scope safeguards, it was unable to get nuclear trade with the United States. And so now, and it has remained that way ever since 1978. Therefore, that means a whole bunch of administrations have come and gone since then, starting with the Carter administration, then with the Reagan administration, the first Bush administration. None of those administrations asked to have that law overturned in some fashion in order to have nuclear trade with India. Now the Bush II administration has come along and they've decided they would like to do that. So all of this nuclear deal with India has to do, among other things, with making changes to the existing law. Now, let me just say that the U.S.-India nuclear agreement actually involves 4 agreements that have to be negotiated and approved. There is the formal agreement, which is required under Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act, which the Nuclear Nonproliferation Act created, that is, those particular conditions. That agreement is being negotiated, and we do not know what is in it yet. Then there has to be a joint resolution of approval requiring congressional action. That joint resolution has been submitted by the administration and has been introduced by request by Senator Lugar on the Senate side and Congressman Hyde on the House side. And we think it may be marked up in the next couple of weeks. Third, there has to be a change in the guidelines of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, a 45-nation group of countries, of which the United States is a member, because that group, which establishes by consensus guidelines for nuclear trade, adheres to the full-scope safeguards criterion. That is one of the guidelines of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is kind of interesting because although it became part of U.S. law in 1978, that it took 14 years for the Nuclear Suppliers Group to accept that as a guideline for all the countries that were doing nuclear trade. And what was the country that was pushing this the most? The United States. It took us 14 years to get the Nuclear Suppliers Group to accept full-scope safeguards as an export criterion, which they did in 1992. Now the United States has turned around and is going to the Nuclear Suppliers Group saying, please change this because we want to have nuclear trade with India. So our credibility with the Nuclear Suppliers Group has gone down as a result of this deal so far. And finally, there has to be a safeguards agreement between India and the IAEA that provides for inspection of India's civilian nuclear facilities. That agreement is also currently being negotiated, and we don't know what's going to be in that agreement either. So there are problems or questions concerning each of these items. No one has seen the Section 123 agreement. No one has seen the safeguards agreement. We don't know what's there. Now, let me just say why I think nuclear trade with India at this point is a bad deal. Ever since Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace proposal, the U.S. has been the leader in building, painstakingly, a worldwide nonproliferation regime. And the regime has developed a collection of norms for nuclear behavior that help minimize the spread of nuclear weapons. And these norms include the full-scope safeguards criterion as a criterion for nuclear export to non-weapon states, and adherence to the requirements of the NPT and appropriate UN resolutions by state parties to the treaty and to the UN. And the proposed agreement with India shreds these norms and represents a giant step backward in U.S. leadership on nonproliferation in general. In particular, as I've already mentioned, the agreement abandons full-scope safeguards, and it also renders moot UN Security Council Resolution 1172 that was passed in 1998 in the wake of the Indian and Pakistani nuclear tests, calling on both countries to halt and reverse their weapon programs and to sign the NPT. And you, I'm sure, remember that we were using Saddam's failure to satisfy UN resolutions as a reason to go to war in Iraq, and now not satisfying UN resolutions brings you nuclear trade if the U.S. is your friend. The agreement also arguably puts the U.S. in violation of its own commitments to the NPT under Article 1. Under Article 1 of the NPT, the U.S. is obligated not to assist in any way a non-weapon state to acquire nuclear weapons. Under this nuclear deal, what will happen is, if the deal goes through and the United States sells nuclear fuel to India, that fuel will be used for the civilian nuclear program in India, but we know that India has problems in terms of the production of nuclear fuel. They cannot meet both their goals in the civilian program and in the weapon program simultaneously. Their goals are ambitious, and they can't do both at the same time. But if we sell them nuclear fuel for the civilian program, their goals in the civilian program will be met by U.S. nuclear fuel, and they will therefore be able to take indigenous nuclear fuel produced by India and use that just for the weapons program. So we will help them ramp up their production of nuclear weapons and their rate of production of nuclear weapons, and I think that is arguably a violation of Article 1, which therefore would mean undermining the NPT. In addition, India is issued a get-out-of-jail-free card by having its previous violations of nuclear contracts, which I mentioned earlier, with Canada and the U.S., whitewashed. The agreement for cooperation accepts India's conversion of the Cirrus reactor to a military facility, even though the contract they signed said it was supposed to be for peaceful use only. Now, the Indians argue that, well, there was a disagreement about what peaceful use meant in those days because there were such things as peaceful nuclear explosions being talked about. But if the 74 test was a peaceful nuclear explosion, even if you accepted the Indian argument, which I think is ridiculous, but even if you accepted that argument, what about the fact that they've been producing plutonium for the weapons program all along from that same reactor? The 1998 tests, which they don't say were peaceful nuclear explosions, used plutonium from that reactor. So there is a disconnect in terms of logic. And in any case, I don't think anybody seriously believes the argument about peaceful nuclear explosions. In addition, the breeder program in India is on the military side of the house over there, which means that under the separation agreement that they agreed to do, that is, they agreed to separate their civilian and military facilities so that safeguards would be applied to the civilian side but not to the military side. The breeder program is on the military side. Well, the breeder program is what's going to produce large numbers of nuclear weapons for India when their breeder reactor, which they are currently building, a 500 megawatt reactor, is up and running. So the separation, therefore, really is almost meaningless in terms of any restriction on India's ability to make nuclear weapons. Finally, India, the deal encourages Pakistan to obtain a similar nuclear deal with China, and may rev up the use of the Khan network, which Pakistan needs in order to match India's nuclear weapons production capacity. The deal also risks an acceleration of the nuclear arms race between India and Pakistan, and may in fact trigger an arms race between India and China as well. And finally, I would say that it makes our complaints about Iran's program look like discrimination to Iranian nationalists, and therefore makes it harder for internal Iranian critics of their own program. So those are the problems we can see with the nuclear deal. There may be others, and perhaps really are others, that we can't see until the Section 123 agreement and the safeguards agreement are in hand. Now let me spend a couple of minutes talking about the problems with the joint resolution that is scheduled to be marked up in the House on June 21st and in the Senate on June 28th. In its current form, the resolution alters congressional procedures in current law to make it more difficult for Congress to reject the agreement. There is reason to believe, however, that Congress has gotten its back up on this, and in the markups they will correct it. But in the meantime, as things stand right now, the administration had the nerve to try to get Congress to alter its procedures in current law with respect to the handling of nuclear cooperation agreements. If the change that the administration is proposing were to be accepted, what would happen is that, in essence, the Congress would have to reject the agreement by a two-thirds vote of both houses rather than a positive vote by majority vote, which is what is in current law. The resolution also, which was, as I say, drafted by the administration, allows the President to waive every single sanction in the Atomic Energy Act in case of Indian violations. That means no sanctions for nuclear testing, no sanctions for abrogation of safeguards, no sanctions for violations of the Section 123 agreement itself. The President could waive all of those. The resolution substitutes presidential determinations for the Section 123 agreement itself, so you can't tell if all the provisions which are currently in law, which are required under current law, will be in there. For example, the resolution doesn't say anything about U.S. consent rights on enrichment or reprocessing. Under current law, a country that receives nuclear materials from the United States cannot enrich that material or cannot reprocess spent fuel that is produced from that material in order to get plutonium without coming back to the United States and asking for permission to do so. There's nothing in the resolution that says that there is a restriction on enrichment or reprocessing for India. It would be in the Section 123 agreement if they paid attention to current law, but since we haven't seen the 123 agreement, we don't know whether it's in there. There is also the question of what kind of safeguards will attach to the Indian civilian facilities. Under normal circumstances, one would expect that the safeguards, the safeguard agreement that India would agree to with the IAEA would have safeguards in perpetuity. That is, even if the agreement were to expire, even if the agreement were somehow to go away some other way, India would still be obligated to have safeguards on its civilian nuclear facilities. Well, that agreement is being negotiated. The Indians have said that they do not want to have permanent safeguards unless they get guarantees of nuclear fuel, in other words, guaranteed supply. Well, I don't know how the IAEA could guarantee any supply. In any case, it's an open question as to exactly what kind of safeguards will be the result of the current negotiations. Finally, all the presidential determinations that are in the current joint resolution relate to Indian policies that were in place prior to the agreement, except for the separation agreement. And the separation agreement, as I say, puts no restrictions or restraints on India's ability to make as many nuclear weapons as it wants. In other words, we are getting nothing, basically, from the Indians in this agreement in terms of their policies that they weren't already doing before this agreement. And therefore, all we've done is to cave in completely to the Indian nuclear lobby. Now, I'd like to say a few words, and how much time do I have left? Okay. I want to say a few words about the arguments raised by proponents of the nuclear deal. Their arguments fall into four categories, and I'll take them up one by one. First, they say India's nuclear weapons are a fait accompli, and India has a good non-proliferation record, so we should treat India the way we treat other weapon states under the NPT. To that I say, first of all, India has a bad record when you look at its own nuclear program, as I have already pointed out. It cheated on those two nuclear contracts with Canada and the U.S. It was the first country to illegally use civilian nuclear facilities to make nuclear weapons and produce weapon materials, and it's still doing so in continuous violation of those original contracts. Moreover, if India should be treated as a nuclear weapon state, then at least it should do what all the other weapon states are doing, namely stop the production of fissile material for weapons, which the 5 weapon states are doing, and also sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. One wouldn't ask it to ratify it, since not all of the weapon states have ratified it, but the signature should be there, and agree to work toward nuclear disarmament, which all the nuclear weapon states are obligated to do under Article 6 of the NPT. The second thing that the proponents say is that India is a growing country with 1/5 of the world's population and large energy needs, so providing India with nuclear energy helps them and helps us by reducing their use of oil, thereby reducing pressure on the price of oil in international markets. And it will also reduce greenhouse gases, since India uses huge amounts of dirty coal. Well, in 2005, only 1% of India's electricity generated for the national grid came from oil. Nuclear energy will back out very little oil from the Indian economy, since India uses oil, as we do, mainly for transportation and industrial applications for which electricity is inappropriate. And as to greenhouse gases, India would do much better, much cheaper, and much faster by increasing efficiency of production and use of energy rather than going to nuclear. Third, they say, improving our bilateral relations with India via the nuclear agreement will bring in tangible benefits by way of Indian cooperation as a counterweight to Chinese influence in Asia and in the war on terror. Well, India is a fiercely independent country and will do no one's bidding in its relationship with other countries, including China and, I would add, Iran. India has signed trade agreements with China. It has energy and defense-related agreements with Iran. This will not change. It's not in India's national security interest to have a bad relationship with China or Iran. India also has been a victim of terror attacks. It has every motivation to work against terrorism, and the nuclear agreement will not make any difference in that respect. India's relationship with the U.S. will continue to prosper with or without a nuclear agreement. We have a large set of cooperative activities going on involving trade, technology, international business, and cultural exchange. This will grow whether or not there is a nuclear agreement. And finally, the proponents say the agreement will bring non-proliferation benefits because India will cooperate in not sending technology to other countries to help them make nuclear weapons. It will continue its current voluntary moratorium on nuclear testing. And finally, it will put 14 civilian reactors under safeguards in accordance with the agreement separating civilian and military facilities. Well, my response to that is that India has good reasons not to help other countries to make nuclear weapons, and that will continue. And it will continue its moratorium on testing until it believes it needs to test. So the voluntary moratorium is really, it's important, and I'm glad they're doing it, but no one should feel that if this nuclear agreement goes through, that ipso facto, India will somehow not test if it feels it needs to test. As far as the 14 reactors are concerned that will be under safeguards, 4 of them already are under safeguards, and the most meaningful part of the Indian program where safeguards could have made a difference in Indian production of nuclear weapons, namely the breeder program, will not be safeguarded. And moreover, India has sole discretion under the agreement as to whether any new reactor will be civilian or military. So there isn't even any guarantee that any future reactor will be safeguarded. I think my time is probably up. I was going to say something about amendments that could be offered to make the agreement a lot better than it is at the moment. I'll save that for Q&A. Thank you.
Len has covered a lot of ground admirably, so I will be brief. When 37 Nobel laureates speak to us with one voice, I think it makes sense for us to listen. The Bush administration takes big risks. The Bush administration believes that these trying times require big risks. for big possible gains. The Bush administration makes these decisions without a great deal of consultation on Capitol Hill or with our friends and allies. The Bush administration makes these decisions in a very closed decision-making loop. It makes these decisions based on very crucial assumptions, which, because of its decision-making process, may not be carefully vetted. We have seen this decision-making process with respect to the war in Iraq, which was based on wildly unrealistic assumptions and therefore contained huge downside risks, most particularly for our men and women in uniform who are now paying the consequences. Because of the Bush administration's decision-making process and its penchant for taking big risks, I think we need to listen to the 37 Nobel laureates who are in effect asking us to take a look at these assumptions behind this deal. Are they too wildly unrealistic? Are there embedded in this deal huge downside risks? And if so, what can we do about them? The administration has not asked of India very much in terms of shoring up global efforts to prevent proliferation. This has been a very benevolent negotiation. I think it's the most benevolent act of U.S. diplomacy since the Lend-Lease agreements in 1942. And I hope that those of you who don't know what the hell I'm talking about will go to your history books and figure out what the Lend-Lease agreements were about. We were trying to help some friends and allies who were bearing the brunt of the Nazi war machine with some military equipment while we were trying to figure out a way to be of even greater help. Now, the circumstances surrounding this deal are quite a bit different from 1942. What are the biggest downside risks associated with this deal? There are many. And if you talk, as I've had a chance to talk, with members of Congress and their staffs on both sides of the aisle, including members of Congress who will support this agreement, you will hear from them that they have very considerable misgivings. Anyone who thinks in any depth about the problems of proliferation that we face will have misgivings about this deal. And it is wholly unsupportable to argue, as this administration does in public, that this is a net plus for nonproliferation. It's not so. The real issue before us is how do we limit proliferation risks from here on out. The two greatest proliferation risks are that the administration's assumption, number one, that the carve-out, the modifications to the rules of nuclear commerce that we have spent decades trying to tighten, that this carve-out will be limited to India and India alone. That's a crucial assumption. If that assumption proves out to be on a par with, say, the war in Iraq will be a cakewalk, and that we'll get out quickly our armed forces will not be placed in a cruel vice, and the oil revenues will pay for it. If this assumption, in this case, that we will only carve out an exception for India and nobody else, if that assumption is wrong, we are in a world of hurt. And there will be other deals. It is a unfortunate, structural fact of life that the states that the treaty regime recognizes as holding nuclear weapons are also the states that stand to make the most profit if the rules of nuclear commerce are weakened. And I do not believe that this nonproliferation system can withhold or withstand circumstances by which the states that are recognized as holding nuclear weapons also become big profit takers with respect to nuclear commerce. Think about that. Think about it. So how do we minimize the downside risk of a loosening of the rules of nuclear commerce that apply well beyond India? That's crucial. My answer to this question is that we need to enforce the consensus rule in the cartel of nuclear suppliers, the nuclear suppliers group. This is a most unusual cartel. It's the only cartel in the world, thanks to the United States and other stakeholders in the Nonproliferation Treaty. It's the only cartel in the world that is designed to stop profit-taking, when profit-taking can lead to grievous proliferation. Doesn't work all the time. There have been carve-outs, but it's worked most of the time to our benefit. So, what I would say to those who, like myself, who want to improve relations with India across a broad spectrum, also want to prevent proliferation, I would say we need to understand this consensus role in the Paris group. Now that imposes on the Bush administration a heavy burden, because it means the Bush administration has to get the agreement of 45 countries in the nuclear suppliers group, every one of them, to agree to help India. But hold on to that consensus rule in case somebody else wants to do a deal that is hugely damaging so we can veto it. That's number one. We have to have this. If the Congress does not insist on the consensus rule, we're in a world of pain. The second biggest downside risk that I see from this deal is that it makes it easier for India to resume nuclear testing. Now, there are a lot out there, regrettably, that wouldn't mind a resumption of nuclear testing. India's not alone. Pakistan wouldn't mind. China wouldn't mind. United States Bush administration wouldn't mind. Russia certainly wouldn't mind. Maybe North Korea wouldn't mind. Others. Not all of these countries would be willing to go first to break a global moratorium on nuclear weapon testing, which has been in place for 8 years. India has proven that it has the willpower to break a global moratorium on nuclear weapons testing. It did so 2 years after the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was negotiated in 1998. We should be doing nothing to disarm a future president and a future Congress from trying to dissuade India from a resumption of nuclear testing. Because India might be the first, it won't be the last. And a resumption of nuclear testing could be hugely injurious to global nonproliferation efforts. Now, how does this agreement remove leverage to try and persuade India not to resume nuclear testing? Number one, it doesn't call on India to accept a legal obligation not to test, like 170 plus other countries. Bush administration didn't do that. Bush administration has promised the government of India assured fuel supplies, including the possibility of a nuclear fuel bank to New Delhi to guard against disruption of fuel supplies. What would cause a disruption in fuel supply? Take a guess. Why would the Bush administration or the Congress guarantee fuel supplies regardless of what the government of India in the future might say or do? What's the point of that? I think the United States should assure India of fuel. But it should not assure India of fuel regardless of what the government of India decides to do. We don't do that for anybody else. If the government of India provides assurances that it will not break a moratorium on nuclear weapons testing, if it is in conformity with standard U.S. obligations under nuclear cooperation agreements with other states, we ought to provide fuel. But we ought not to make it easier for the government of India to resume nuclear testing. That's stupid. So these are the two key ways that I can identify at this point with limiting downside risk associated with this agreement. Thank you very much.
Are there questions?